recap of what we did last week. So if you remember the cartoon, right? If we leave it up to the free market, we will see that some individuals, which are mainly the lower income individuals, they will be unable to afford the essential goods and service. That's why there's inequity. So if we look at the market for insulin, right? If the government thinks that the prices of insulin are too high when left to the free market, what do? They will impose a price floor or price ceiling. Yes, they will impose a price ceiling. So a price ceiling is the maximum price that the producers can sell at. And what does that do? It helps to decrease the price of insulin so that more consumers are able to afford it. Let's recap. I'm just repeating what I said last week. So if we look at the market for wheat, and wheat has an equilibrium price of $3. If the government feels that the wheat farmers, they cannot afford, if they think that they cannot earn sufficient income, so what would they do to help the wheat farmers? What do they do to help producers? What do they impose?
Price floor.
They will impose a price floor. So a price floor is the minimum price that the producers must charge. And since it's higher than the equilibrium price, right, it will help producers increase their income. And when producers, which is the wheat farmers, when their income increases, they will be able to afford more essential goods and services. So price ceiling and price floor help different groups. The price ceiling, it will help the consumers, while price floor helps the producers. So today what we're going to do, we are going to do the other two forms of government intervention. First is subsidies and grants. Okay? So what are subsidies? Subsidies is the money given by the government to producers to lower the cost of production and increase supply. So you should find that on page 3 of your notes. So don't bother about the blanks first, okay? We'll fill it up later. So one example of subsidies is like subsidies for businesses in Singapore if they send their employees for training. Then how is subsidies different from grants? So grants, right, they are sums of money that the government gives to a particular group of individuals or households. Basically, it's given to the consumers. And the distribution of grants is mean tested. So what does mean tested mean? So if you all know your USave rebates, right, that the Singapore government gives to Singapore households to offset utility bills, right? Can you see that the government does not give every household the same amount? There is a criteria, which is what kind of house do you live in? Do you live in a 1-room flat, a 2-room flat, or a 3-room flat? So you can see for a 1 and 2-room flat, they are given $190. A 3-room flat is given $170. So this is what it means by it's means tested. So the grant is only given to people who meet a certain criteria. And in the case for USave, the criteria is what type of house do you live in. So we'll move on to activity 2. So activity 2, I think is on page 4. It's on page 4. The graphs are on page 4. The explanation is on page 3. So we'll flip between page 4 and page 3, okay? So if we look at subsidies first, the graph is on page 4. When I give subsidies, what happens to the supply curve? It shifts to the left or to the right? Subsidies. Right, raise hands. Okay, shifts to the right. I saw one hand there at the back. So it shifts to the right. So on page 4, you copy down what happens to the diagram. After you're done copying what happens to the diagram, you flip to page 3 to fill in the blanks. Page 3 is the explanation. Okay? Why does the supply curve shift to the right? Is because subsidies lowers the cost of production for producers, and therefore it increases the supply. And when supply increases, it shifts to the right to S1, and you see your equilibrium price falling while equilibrium quantity rising. And that it means that there are lower prices now and goods and services are more affordable for the poor. I repeat one more time, the graph is on page 4, but the explanation is on page 3. So you need to toggle between page 4 and page 3 to jot this down. Oh yeah, you can take a photo and go home and copy also can. Can I move on? Who said no? Okay, let's move on. What about grants? Grants are given to consumers. So does the demand shift or the supply shift? The demand shifts? The supply shift? No, the demand shifts. And why does the demand shift? So the grants will increase the disposable income of the households and thereby increasing their purchasing power. Since they have higher purchasing power, they can afford more goods and services. Therefore, the demand for essential goods and services will increase, and the demand curve will shift to the right. Then we can see now they have a higher ability to afford necessities, and then thereby there's a more equitable outcome. Same thing, page 4 is the diagram, page 3 is the explanation. Okay. I'm going to move on. If cannot copy in time, then you just take a photo. Okay. So what are the limitations of subsidies and grants? First, imperfect information. The government actually doesn't know the ideal amount of subsidies or grants to give to the poor so that they can afford goods and services. And then if we give them too much of subsidies and grants, society as a whole, both the consumers and the producers might be very reliant on the government. And the government actually has limited budget. So there's a trade-off with other aspects of the country. So the previous example was on healthcare, right? So if we are giving subsidies and grants to healthcare, then what about the other industries like education, like our transport infrastructure? So this is a budget deficit that the government needs to think about. So subsidies and grants are quite straightforward, okay? Then we move on to social security. Social security, in your notes, is only one small paragraph. So social security is actually the government payouts that provide cash benefits to individuals who cannot work or earn an income for themselves. So some types of social securities, one is the unemployment benefit that is given to those that are unemployed. Then state pensions are those that are given to retirees. So what are the limitations of social securities, right? It's very similar to that of subsidies and grants. If there's too much of social securities, the poor is very reliant on the government. So they decide, oh, anyway, the government will give me $100 a month. I maybe don't need to go and find a job anymore. So it creates a disincentive to work or stay employed since they can just rely on the government to support them. And lastly, it's the same thing, the strain on the government budget. So these are the three measures, three government interventions to help resolve the problem of inequity. First, price ceiling, price floor. Second, social securities. And lastly, subsidies and grants. Next, we need to go to these two terms. Income inequality versus inequity. So now you can turn to page 12. I'm on page 12 now. So what you need to know that income inequality and inequity, right? They are two separate concepts. They are not the same. Income inequality is about the extent to which income is distributed unequally in the economy. However, for inequity, we are looking at some individuals in the economy that do not have access to essential goods and services. So they are not the same. So what is the relationship between them? Greater income inequality may lead to inequity. You must focus on the word may. Look. So how do I see these pictures are not in your notes? You can jot it down if you want. Highlighter. Okay, look, how do I see income inequality? It's the difference between the rich and poor income. This is income inequality. How do I see if there's inequity? To see if there's inequity, I need to see if whether the poor is able to afford essential goods and services. So as you can see, country A, the poor's income is higher than the price of essential goods. Therefore, in country A now, there is no inequity because the poor can buy the essential goods. So when there is greater income inequality, what does that mean? The rich gets richer. The poor gets poorer. Okay? Rich gets richer, poor gets poorer. Can you see now your income inequality? The difference between the rich income and the poor income is a lot greater now. And in this case, is there inequity? Yes? Yes, there is inequity in this case. Because now the poor can no longer afford essential goods. Can? Same thing, country B, right? This is my income inequality now. The difference between the rich and the poor. Now, the rich gets richer, the poor gets poorer. So there is greater income inequality. The gap is now bigger. However, in this case, is there inequity? There's no inequity, because the poor can still afford essential goods and services. So it does not lead to inequity. Therefore, that's why the relationship between these two concepts is greater income inequality may lead to inequity, because it's not every case that it leads to inequity. So first takeaway, income inequality and inequity are two separate concepts. Next, greater income inequality may lead to inequity. So how do we measure income inequality, right? It's through the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient is derived from the Lorenz curve. So the horizontal axis is the cumulative percentage of households from the poorest to richest, while the vertical axis shows the cumulative percentage of the national income they receive. The formula of Gini coefficient is area A divided by the area A plus B. Okay, then now let's go on to activity 7. So y'all can jot this down. If you don't know how to jot this down, you just take a photo, okay? How do we interpret the Gini coefficient and income distribution? So if the Lorenz curve is a straight line, basically if the Lorenz curve is not the dotted line there, it overlaps with the 45-degree line. It would mean that if you see the dotted lines in blue, the poorest 20% of the households, they will receive 20% of the national income. The poorest 20% of households here, they will receive 20% of national income. And what does that mean? When this line overlaps with the 45-degree line, it means that area A disappears. So if area A is 0, 0 divided by 0 plus 1, you get 0. Therefore, the Gini coefficient is 0. And in this case, income is distributed equally. Can I move on? Any questions? Take photos if you cannot copy in time. I know there's a lot of words. Honestly, you also can watch my recording that I upload like over the weekend. Part B here. If the Lorentz curve hangs below the 45-degree line, so if the Lorentz curve now is this bolded line here. So at point X, right, you'll see that the poorest 60% of the households, they actually only receive 25% of national income. So there is income inequality because the poorest 60%, they only enjoy 25% of the income. So what is the next sentence about? It says that the further the curve drops below the 45-degree line, the larger the size of area A and the bigger the Gini coefficient value. So if the Lorentz curve is no longer the bolded black line, it becomes this red line over here. My area A is no longer this shaded, highlighted yellow portion anymore. It is the highlighted yellow portion plus the blue portion. So can you see now A increases? But A plus B, the area is always the triangle, so it always remains the same. So it remains the same. And therefore, your Gini coefficient remains the same. No, your Gini coefficient increases. Therefore, income inequality has increased. Can? Now move on. You take photos if you cannot copy in time. A. Now we move on to the limitations of Gini coefficient. So first thing first is we need to be sure whether we are looking at the pre-tax or post-tax coefficient. So different countries, right, when they calculate Gini coefficient, some use pre-tax income to calculate the Gini coefficient. Some use post-tax income to calculate the Gini coefficient. And therefore, the Gini coefficient derived is different. So just in Singapore's case alone, right, the pre-tax Gini coefficient, which is the blue line, is higher than the post-tax coefficient, which is the orange line below. So it is not fair if, for example, country A uses pre-tax income to calculate Gini coefficient, country B uses post-tax income to calculate Gini coefficient. We cannot compare it like that. The next limitation, right, is the non-monetary income. Because not all the time your Gini coefficient is calculated only by your cash income. It does not include like if I have a farm and then I farm my own produce for my own consumption. Because I save money when I have my own farm and farm for my own consumption. I don't have to go to the market. So all these are not included in my calculation of the Gini coefficient. So this is another limitation. Then conclusion. So back to the start, what are the microeconomic objectives of the government? First is efficiency, next is equity. So in this chapter, we are focused on equity. The definition of equity is the fairness of the distribution of economic welfare. And then we learned that there is inequity when it is left to the free market to decide like what are the prices of essential goods and services. Then we looked at how the government can intervene to help promote equity. Firstly, by subsidies and grants. Next, social securities. Third, price controls, which is further divided into price ceiling and price floor. Then we also learned that income inequality and inequity are two separate concepts, and the relationship between them, income inequality may cause inequity. Then we zoomed in on income inequality alone and learn about Gini coefficient as a tool to measure income inequality. So that was the whole chapter that we did so far. Questions? No questions? Then we have come to the end of H1 syllabus for JC1. Yes. So now Mr. Trump will post model. Ini juga boleh.